Hi everyone, I'm Naomi Alonzo, and together with my partner Beanca Guzman, we will discuss the first four chapters of our third assigned reading for this course entitled An Intro to the Principles of Morals by Jeremy Bentham. Pero before we start, sino nga ba si Jeremy Bentham? Jeremy Bentham is the acknowledged father of utilitarianism or a moral theory that promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number of individuals. He is also an English philosopher, jurist, and social reformer. He was born on February 15, 1748 and died on June 6, 1832. Before he died, he requested one final act to demonstrate his philosophy of providing the greatest good for the greatest number. He wanted his body to be preserved after his autopsy as a symbol and an encouragement for people to donate their bodies to science kasi it would help a lot sa mga medical students. Actually, yung body niya is displayed sa University College London ngayon. When I say na body niya lang yun nandun, literal na body niya lang kasi yung head niya na naka-display ay wax lang. Why? This is an actually interesting and a bit weird story kasi alam nyo ba that his original head ay kinidnap ng mga students back in 1990s. Hindi ko alam kung anong mafe-feel ko about doon kasi 'di ba, why kidnap the head of a 200-year-old philosopher? Pero ayun, thankfully naibalik na yung head niya and ikakabit na daw sa original body niya this year. So, ayun, anyway, before we dive into what Bentham meant by the principle of utility, let's define what utility is. Utility ay yung mga bagay na nagpo-promote ng kabutihan o kaligayahan sa mga individual na may kinalaman dito. Pero pwede rin siyang yung mga bagay na nakakapag-prevent ng mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness sa kanila. So, based from this, what is the principle of utility? The principle of utility approves or disapproves of every action according to its tendency to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question. Now, there are three things that I would like to emphasize in this definition. First is augment or diminish the happiness. According to Bentham, happiness is our final goal. We do everything that we do to attain happiness. For example, we study to get good grades or learn something. Why? Perhaps because we want to have our dream job someday that has good money. And you know, money can be a tool to attain happiness. Anyway, ayun, the principle of utility indicates that all of us want to be happy. Hence, utilitarianism believes that happiness should guide our morality. Second is the word tendency. Utilitarianism is a moral theory na nakafocus sa results, tendency, or consequences of our actions. Kaya this moral theory is consequentialist in nature, meaning it treats intention as irrelevant and that good consequences are a result of good actions. Lastly, the party whose interest is in question. While the principle of utility focuses on happiness or pleasantness of action as it is in hedonistic moral theory, meaning to be good, one must be pleasant, hindi ibig sabihin that it is egoistic in nature. It is actually the opposite of egoism, as utilitarianism is other regarding. Sure, we ought to pursue the happiness and avoid pain, pero it says that we should pursue happiness not just for ourselves, but for as many sentient beings as possible, including dito yung non-human animals. Bentham also said that our interests are important, but it is not more than important than the interest of others. And he said that when we're making decisions, we must put ourselves in a position of a benevolent, disinterested spectator kasi we tend to have a bias regarding our own interests. So, ayun, it was the opposite of egoism in psychology. Now, there are several kinds of utilitarianism, but our main focus for this discussion is act or classical utilitarianism. Classical utilitarianism states that for any given action, we must choose the action that produces the greatest good for the greatest number. Period. To demonstrate this, here's a famous philosophical dilemma formulated by Philip Foot in 1967 called the Trolley Problem. This is a popular dilemma kasi it forces us to think on how to choose when there are no good choices. Do we pick the action with the best outcome or do we stick to the moral code that prohibits causing someone's death? In this dilemma, may trolley na mabilis ang takbo papunta sa 5 tao na hindi makagalaw. And you are standing next to a lever. If you pull, the trolley will switch to a different track, kung saan isa lang yung taong naka-tied up. You only have two options. Do nothing, kung saan the trolley will surely kill the 5 people on the main track, or pull the lever, diverting the trolley onto the side track, where it will only kill 1 person. Which do you think is the more ethical option? Or simply, what is the right thing to do? According to the principle of utility, to divert yung trolley para isa lang yung mamatay. So, from that example, who do you think is the primary concern? Yung mas nakararami, di ba? Or yung community. Now, Bentham also defined what the interest of the community is sa reading. According to him, community is a fictitious body composed of the individual persons who are considered as constituting, as it were, its members. Therefore, the interest of the community is the sum interest of the several members who compose it. Kaya daw, it is in vain to talk of the interest of the community without understanding what is the interest of the individual. So, what is the interest of an individual? He said that its interest ay yung mga bagay na nakadaragdag sa total sum of its pleasures or nakababawas ng sum total ng kanyang pains. Note that the emphasis here are your pleasures and pains. These two sovereign masters, according to Bentham, are what governs us all in all we do, in all we say, and in all we think. Ito yung nagde-determine kung ano ba ang dapat natin gawin at kung ano ba ang tama sa mali. Good or tama if it pleasures, while bad or mali if it pains. Kung kaya ang action ng isang tao o government is said to conform sa principle of utility if yung tendency nito na increase yung happiness ng community ay mas mataas kumpara sa chance na ma-diminish ito. Or ito yung sinasabi natin kanina that the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, we've talked about what utility is and ano yung mga actions na dapat gawin to conform dito. Pero bakit natin dapat ito pagbasihan ng ating mga actions? Tested and napatunayan na ba yung integrity? Or may proof na ba ang principle na ito kaya dapat natin sundan or paniwalaan at least? According to Bentham, wala kasi it is impossible to prove something that is used to prove everything else. However, he also said that wala naman daw tao gaano man ka-stupid or perverse ang nag-defer sa principle of utility o sa mga bagay na nagpapasiya sa kanya dahil natural na daw na gawin o sundan natin ang mga bagay na nagpapasiya sa atin. And we do this without thinking or sometimes without reserve or hesitations. And sinabi niya that those who argues against the principle of utility proves not that the principle is wrong, but the examples used is misapplied. Kaya daw mahirap na i-disprove ang principle of utility at for those who wants to go through the trouble of questioning it, may 10 questions si Bentham. I won't present or explain it anymore dito sa presentation, but please feel free to check out the handouts. I tried to simplify and explain it doon based on my understanding of such questions. And now, to discuss the next part of our presentation, here's Bianca.
Thank you, Naomi. Now let's talk about the principles that do not promote utility or pleasure to an individual. According to Bentham, there are two adverse principles that does not favor utility. First, the principle of asceticism, where a person must deny themselves of the physical pleasures of life in order to earn more greater and lasting pleasure in this lifetime or in their next life. And the principle of sympathy and apathy, where it pertains to the feeling of instinctive approval or disapproval for the expected consequences of an action. Now, the principle of asceticism is the opposite of utility. It approves of actions which tend to diminish happiness or pleasure and approve of them when they tend to encourage it. Now, there are two groups that openly embraces this principle. First, the moralists and the religionists. For them, practicing strict self-denial of worldly pleasures is a measurement of their personal and spiritual discipline. And although they follow the same principle, they have different motives for complying with it. Though sometimes their beliefs will naturally mingle one another since they have the need to conform and driven by our own morals or fear by God's wrath and in the afterlife. For the moralists, they are driven by hope, which is hope for philosophic pride and reputation. They lead a moral life and are concerned with moral principles and the problems, and also aim to regulate morals of others. Moralists takes it to the next level of extreme that they prevent themselves from the pleasures of life. Now, Bentham said they have discarded only what they have called the gross. For example, this guy from Nas Daily named Rob Greenfield, as you can see here, is environmentally friendly in that he does not have a car, bank account, does not own a cell phone, no bills, and does not buy tissues, and instead he grows it using leaves from a tree, and everything he owned totals to only 50 items that fit his backpack. He did not care about the environment before, he was so focused on material things, and he realized that he can do something to help the environment by living sustainably. Now, another example is this guy named Daniel, and he does not pay anything. He is what you call a free gun, and he does not spend money on food. He eats the unfinished food of people at restaurants, and he also goes to the trash bins at night to gather discarded items like clothes and even technology like Xbox. And he does not spend his money like any of it. And for him, it is his way of saving his savings forever, hence not, spending it. Okay, let's go to religionists. We have the religionists, which I think we are very familiar with. They follow fear, which is fear of punishment from God. And religions such as Muslim, Catholicism, and others are very compliant with their practices. For example, we have here the monks. They have this thing called exercises, and it consists of so many contrivances that they have for tormenting themselves. And by this, they thought to do this for their deity. And they said making themselves as unhappy as they can is a way to please the deity, and they will be rewarded in their next life. So that's it for the religionists. Now we have the criticisms about the principle of asceticism, since it seems that it cannot be applied to the government, and especially for the religionists. We know of saints like Pedro Calungsod, Lorenzo Ruiz, who are Filipino saints in the country, and those who took up CLE during their elementary or in high school. And I think we are very familiar with saints. They prefer to live a simple life. They discard their treasures, ganyan, yung mga stories nila, diba? And then they also live very simply, and then they also sacrifice themselves for God. And sabi ni Bentham, none of them set themselves to work daw and made laws on purpose, despite their morals. And with the view of putting religionist individuals daw in the government, according to Bentham, will only produce a breed of highwaymen, which I searched was a robber with a gun and riding a horse, typically. Housebreakers daw, like manloloob ng mga bahayan, or incendiaries, which is people who commonly stir conflict. And the more you deprive yourself of the pleasures of life, the more you get used to it. And the more you fall in love with putting yourself in pain. So that is the problem with asceticism. For people who practice asceticism, pain is pleasure. And they think or believe that the pain they experience will gain them merit, be it in this life or in their next life. Dahil nga, sabi nga ni Bentham, it is easier to follow the principle of utility, like to make everyone happy, than to follow asceticism. Kasi sabi niya, let but 1/10 part of the inhabitants of this earth pursue principle of asceticism consistently. And in a day's time, they will have turned it into hell daw. So, maybe for him, mas gugustuhin niya nga talaga ang separation of the church and the state. So, yes. Okay. Now, let's proceed to the adverse principle of utility, which is the principle of sympathy and antipathy. So sympathy talks about sharing a common feeling towards others, and antipathy, which is strong feeling of opposition or dislike. According to Bentham, this principle is merely a disposition to approve or disapprove of an action, and is not an affirmative principle of moral conduct. And for him to determine what to approve or disapprove heavily depends on our feelings. Subjective siya. Pwedeng it is wrong since I don't feel na tama siya, I feel like it's wrong, I don't like it, I don't believe in it, or I don't approve of it. So that's how you make a moral decision. Since ganito ang patakaran ng principle of sympathy and antipathy, it avoids the obligation of appealing to any outside opinion, which prevails the people to accept the sentiment of the person or group of people as the truth, or that's the way it is. Now, okay, this principle is used for applying punishment in many cases which deserve none, and in many cases which deserve some. Also, ito yung makikita natin sa mga legal systems dito sa Philippines. Sabi nga ni Bentham sa punishment, if you hate much, punish much. If you hate little, punish little, and punish as you hate. If you hate not at all, punish not at all. Makikita mo napaka-subjective talaga ng pag-apply ng principle of sympathy and antipathy. Kasi kung ano lang yung nakikita mo ayaw doon sa person na yun, edi mali na siya. Okay, example. We have here Imelda Marcos, who was convicted for 7 counts of graft last 2018, and she was sentenced to 6 to 11 years in prison for each count of graft. And the police did not move to arrest Marcos despite the warrant issued by the Sandigan Bayan. And Albayalde even said that the police had to take into consideration her age and as well as her health. Now, on the other hand, we have Mang Juan, a 61-year-old Filipino who was charged for stealing the lunch of a 14-year-old student on June 15, 2016, and it was only worth 20 pesos. The prosecutor stated that Mang Juan stole the food willfully, unlawfully, and feloniously for only 20 pesos. And the judge sentenced him to 10 days in jail, and but due to miscommunication, Mang Juan ended up staying in jail for more than 3 years. So imagine from 10 days, naging 3 years ang pagstay niya sa kulungan dahil lamang sa 20 pesos na pagkain. Okay. Now, this principle is very alarming since everyone can become a criminal under the eyes of law and regardless of how little your immoral deed is. Now, sabi nga ni Bentham, any difference in taste, any difference in opinion upon one subject as well as upon another, and no disagreement so trifling which perseverance and altercation will not render serious, and each becomes in the other's eyes an enemy, and if laws permit, a criminal. So everyone can become a criminal dahil nga we have conflicting views. So, bakit di na lang naglagay ng theological principle si Bentham? So, Bentham said that it is not a distinct principle daw from the three principles stated earlier. So, this principle, the theological, talks about to recur for the standard of right and wrong to the will of God. Di ba nga ang will of God, alam natin na tama at mali, like according sa Bible, yung nakasulat, ganyan. But sabi dito, whatever it is in God's will is morally right. And the theological principle refers to God's pleasure. So, ano nga ba yung God's pleasure and how do we know what God's pleasure is today when we don't talk to Him or He doesn't write to us? So we can figure it out now by observing our own pleasure and declaring it to be His. So whatever that we do na mabuti ay mabuti rin para sa Kanya. So how do we know that it is in God's will that such act should be avoided? Sabi natin sa principle of utility because pag nag-engage ako dito, baka ayaw ng buong community ko, like di sila magiging masaya. Pwedeng sa principle of asceticism, baka pag nag-engage ako dito, gross siya or masyado siyang nagpo-produce ng pleasure sa akin. So ayoko. Pwede rin sa principle of sympathy and antipathy, ayoko. I have negative feelings towards it. Lalaman natin through those three principles na it is morally wrong in engaging in such acts kasi meron tayong na-feel about it. Meron tayong detestment about it, gross siya, ganyan, or malulungkot, hindi magiging happy yung group of people na kinabibilangan ko. So, hindi na nilagyan ng theological principle ni Bentham kasi may explain naman siya ng iba pang principle. Okay. Now, so there are two things that we need to carefully distinguish since it can be quite confusing. So yung motive or cost, which refers to the act produced by the operating on the mind of an individual and the ground or reason which warrants a legislator, while the other is the other bystander who pertains to someone who commends the act. So antipathy in some cases daw, due to this, can cause an action which is intended with good effects. Parang okay naman siya. Kaso, for Bentham, it still does not make it a right ground for action daw. Unlike for principle of utility, kasi sabi niya, it produces the very worst effects when complying with principle of antipathy. Now, sabi niya, antipathy is always needs to be regulated by the principle of utility. So that's why Bentham clearly states that the principle of utility is the only right ground of action. Okay. Let's proceed with chapter 3. Now, the happiness of a community is the ultimate goal of the legislators, and the standard to which the people need to conform is very reliant upon the legislator. We have four sources of pain and pleasure, or known as the sanctions, namely the physical sanction, political sanction, moral sanction, and religious sanction. Now, let's proceed with discussing the four sanctions. Physical sanction we have here, it is the pure physical consequences of your action. So, ikaw mismo, yung may consequences yung ginagawa mo. For example, I am with my friends and we are drinking out. Yan, matagal bago nag-pandemic. So, nag-inuman kami. And I know that 6 bottles is my limit. And 6 bottles will get me drunk. So that my anticipation of a hangover may be a sanction or the motive that will control the amount that I drink. So, dapat, ako mismo, alam ko na hindi ako dapat sumagad ng 6 na bote kasi di na ako makakauwi. Ganyan. So, that is the physical sanction. Next, we have the political sanction. And for Bentham, this is the legal sanction or punishment. So, penalties are attached by laws. So, people will not do them. And for example, in my case ulit, drinking. Also, there are laws that penalizes people who drunk drive. So, people will not be given a motive to drive when they are not sober. Kasi alam nila na pwede sila makulong or pwede sila matiketan. Ganyan. I don't drive, so I don't know. So, ayun. Basta I know na bawal mag-drunk drive yung mga tao kasi baka ma-aksidente ka din. So, that is mali. That's political sanctions. So merong penalties na naka-attach sa law. Next, we have the moral sanction, which pertains to public opinion, public statements. Ayan. So it happens when someone is concerned about the morality of their actions. For example, when a drunk person causes problems in their community, or kuwari, meron sa mga kaibigan mo, hindi ka nag-aambag sa inuman. Ganun. So, merong may problema na parang, sumasama lang to, tapos di nag-aambag sa inuman. So, i-condemn ka nila, ba't di ka nag-aano, ganyan. Okay, that is moral sanction. That's morally wrong. Ganun, wala kang inaambag. Okay, for last, we have the religious sanction, which are penalties by the higher beings or God connected to actions committed by the people. For example, excessive drunkenness, or you may be expected to go to hell because of excessive drunkenness. Ayan. Or an unfortunate experience may happen to you since you are not being good to yourself. Ganyan. And baka punish ka ni God. All in all, physical sanction bears the groundwork for political sanction and the moral sanction. And while the religious is related to how we live in the present and how we are going to be blessed or punished in our next life. So that is all. Okay, let's go back to Naomi.
Now, we've talked extensively about pain and pleasure, and we've also established that attaining happiness and avoiding pain is our ultimate goal. Now, let's move on to how can we assign value to pleasure or pain, or kung paano i-compute yung happiness. Paano natin masasabi that the pleasure or pain is too great or not? According to Bentham, we have to consider the following circumstances. First is intensity, or kung gaano kalakas yung pleasure. Second is duration, or kung gaano katagal maglalast yung pleasure. And third is certainty or uncertainty, or how likely or unlikely the pleasure will occur. For example, winning the lottery. Intense nga yung happiness kapag nanalo ka, and maaaring sobrang tagal niya maglast, pero sobrang baba naman ng certainty na manalo ka, about 1 out of almost 14 million chance lang meron ka. Anyway, fourth is propinquity or remoteness. Propinquity is just another word for nearness. It asks kung gaano kabilis ang occurrence or ma-experience agad yung pleasure. However, kung gusto natin malaman yung value ng pleasure or pain of any act by which it is produced, may dalawa pa tayong needed consider. First is yung fecundity, or yung probability that an action is followed by sensations of the same kind. Example, pleasurable results ng isang action, nakaka-attract siya ng other pleasurable results. Second is impurity, or the probability that an action is followed by sensations of the opposite kind. Example, pleasurable yung result ng isang action for a while, then it will be followed by pain later on. Finally, we have to add another one to find the value of a pleasure or pain to a number of persons, and that is extent, or kung gaano karaming tao ang maaapektuhan. These factors are part of Bentham's hedonistic or hedonic or felicity calculus. Yung general idea ng hedonic calculus is that we can compute yung quantity ng pleasure or happiness mayroon ng isang act through these 7 factors. Now, if you remember kanina, nabanggit natin that Bentham is not just a philosopher, but he is also a social reformer. He is specifically interested in governmental ethics, as he wants the government to care for our happiness. This is a reason as to why we wanted to turn ethics into an equation, so that we could just give the government the tool, diba, on how to compute for our happiness, to determine what's good for everyone, to determine which action or governmental plans produces the greatest good for the greatest number. Simple lang din yung explanation niya dito sa equation na to. Pleasure is a plus and pain is a minus. The right and good choice is the one that produces the greatest number of pleasures. Here's an example. A moral dilemma na kinakaharap natin madalas for some or most of us. Mag-aral or mag-Shopee. So first factor is intensity. Mas intense yung happiness natin, di ba, kapag nakakuha ng mataas na grade and sumablay compared sa mag-receive ng parcel. Second, duration. Of course, in learnings mo is lifelong. Unlike yung in-order mo from Shopee, although ayun minsan or perhaps most of the time mas certain na marireceive mo yung parcel mo compared sa magtatagal yung learnings mo for a while. Next is propinquity. mas maaga mo rin ma-receive yung parcel mo compared sa supply and grades. And then next is fecundity. Receiving the parcel brings excitement and pleasure, and so is using what you have bought. Pero after a while, kapag nagamit mo na siya or naubos or nasira na, that's when you'll feel na baka nasayang lang yung pera and time mo sa paghanap ng product na iyon. So you'll feel discomfort. Meanwhile, if you use that time to study, may hirapan ka ngayon, pero later on, when you receive your grades na mataas, happy na, and that's purity. Lastly is extent. Most of the time, yung parcel, ikaw lang yung mahihinabang, pero yung supply mo, pamilya mo rin kasi bubuhatin mo sila. Char, hindi. Of course, yung society. Because another scholar ng bayan have graduated. Yay! Although, ayun, makikita naman na medyo dikit ang laban nila based dito. Kaya siguro lagi tayo nahihirapan mamili. Pero ayun, hindi naman daw expected na kailangan natin gawin ito for every moral judgment or decision that we have to make. Pero kailangan daw na dapat natin ito isa-isip palagi as our goal. Always aim to achieve more happiness than pain. Of course, given this very objective take on ethics, Bentham also received his fair share of criticisms. First of which is that his theory is excessively intent on developing scientific principles that he forgot that individuals are persons or human beings too. He forgot that humans are all different. And such objective take on morality is just plain cold and unsympathizing for others. Second is that he was called an armchair philosopher kasi his work is largely theoretical and based on his own ideas lang, without being tested on the real world. Third, according to Sir Acuña's book, John Stuart Mill and Epicurus, who are also both classical utilitarian philosophers, agreed that some pleasures are intrinsically superior to others, for example, intellectual pleasures than bodily pleasures. Lastly, sometimes doing an act for the pleasure of the greatest number of people does not seem right. An example is illustrated dito. Killing a person for his or her organ so the other poor who needs it could live. Granted that poor people would be safe, pero it is not good kasi it decreases utility in the long run kasi yung mga tao sa community matatakot dahil baka sila yung i-sacrifice so that others could live next time. Because of such dilemmas, nagkaroon ng reframing in utilitarianism that led to its other branch called rule utilitarianism, kung saan sinabi that we should refrain from acts that might maximize utility in the short run. Instead, we follow rules that if followed by everyone all the time will maximize the good in the world. Pero yun, Bentham left several manuscripts and contributions naman. It was said that he wrote between 10 to 20 pages of manuscripts per day that is still being translated hanggang ngayon so that his ideas and contributions wouldn't be lost. And that's all for me. Here's Beanca again to wrap up our presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for listening to our report about Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism, and I hope you learned something today. Always stay safe.